Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us on this webinar on a marketer's guide to polarization in America today. Pandemics like COVID don't create polarization, but reveal polarization that is already there, but had been masked and maybe in better times. George Carey, our founder and CEO, will take you through some of the findings from our most recent 2020 wave of our passion points. Today, we will explore polarization in a group that share much because they actually share the same life stage, parenthood. But as you'll see, there is much that also divides them. As always, if you have any questions, as you hear from George, please let us know, and we'll try to find as much time as possible at the back end to answer as many of your questions as possible. George?
Thanks, Philip, and thank you again for joining everybody. It's great to have you here. This is a topic which we are certainly getting a lot of questions about from a bunch of our clients. And I have to say, it's given what Philip just set up, I mean, the extent to which we're hearing about polarization, we really are in our uncharted territory. There's not a lot of precedent in terms of this level of polarization in our global consumer bases that we can sort of fall back on and try and make sense of and how to respond to it. But you don't have to go very far in terms of the newspaper or the evening news report to understand that we are in a time of polarization, social, cultural, economic polarization, the likes of which we haven't seen for many, many years, if ever, in the US and on a global basis also. And again, for many of our clients, and I know this because the phone's been ringing a fair amount lately with asking some of these questions, there's some really significant issues that come with this. One of them is, how will an increasingly polarized population impact the drivers of my category and the attitudes towards my brand? Do I still have kind of enough of a unified consumer base to be able to make any overall conclusions about this? Similarly, while different polarized segments within my user base require different strategies for relevance, do I need to be saying or doing or producing different things for different sort of aspects of this new polarized world? And if so, which polarized segment do I go after? I mean, you can cut the polarized pie a lot of different ways. You can do it based on income, based on ethnicity, based on education, based on political affiliation. You know, how do you begin to think about which of these polarized framing tools to use to make sure you stay relevant going forward? And I think that deep down, most of us are really interested in the final question here, which is, in an increasingly fractious world, is there still common ground on which inclusive brands and content can be built? And that word inclusive is a really important one. For obvious and very good reasons, we've been using that word a lot lately about inclusivity. But how do you do that? You know, is there any kind of ties that bind this world that's become so kind of disjointed around which content and brands can be constructed that will be inclusive and be more holistic for the population as a whole? So, you know, we have a kind of a way of thinking about the world of marketing, but also there's this topic on which this analysis and this research is based, which you may find useful also. And that is that if you look at the world and this topic of polarization through a behavioral lens, behaviors tend to amplify and exaggerate our perception of the level of polarization within this country, within this target, within your category. You know, obviously the elections is a great example of that. I mean, the kind of the behavioral differences in how we voted were massively apparent to all of us from a behavioral standpoint. And that's the same thing is true with other frames of polarization. Behaviors magnify the differences. But we have found, and you're going to see in a few minutes here, that if you look at the world through an emotional lens, emotions tend to minimize polarization, revealing the unifying human truths from which inclusive brands and content can grow. You know, what you're going to see here very clearly is that while behaviors can be quite different, there's still way more that binds us together emotionally than divides us. And it's in those territories we think that inclusive brands can be built. So for those of you who don't know us or our company all that well, we do have a really cool research tool for helping us navigate this topic of polarization, in addition to other topics, and it's called Passion Points. This is the only survey that we know, the only sort of construct that we know that quantifies the emotional drivers of consumer choice. We measure 50 different passion points. We group them into 5 factors. These are rooted in proven models of human need. We have standardized calculations that let us look at both intensity, and by that I mean how important is this passion point to you right this minute today, as a consumer, as well as over time. We've been doing this for 10 years. So we can see exactly how these emotional priorities are fluctuating from year to year and through various episodes of cultural upheaval. We do it globally, and we also do it across 4 different cohorts, kids, Gen Z, millennials, and parents, and we also look within categories. We are a small company. We have very big clients, and we're very proud of those clients, and we think that they all come to us because emotion and the emotional drivers of choice have become so central to how they think about their categories and their content and their brands. So just to give you a little more clarity before I jump into this on what a passion point is, I use the word emotion a lot. Passion points are not emotions. Emotions are things like sadness or disgust or surprise or anger. And those are interesting, but to us, that's not granular or actionable enough to know exactly how to leverage. The passion points that we measure are emotional priorities. Grouped into these 7 different categories. Are you more concerned right now, or your emotional sort of emphasis more focused on having fun together or safety? Are you more focused on your career or the climate? So we have those kinds of data comparisons that can give us a really clear idea on where these emotional priorities are across 4 cohorts and within each one of these categories. And what we do with passion points is it lets us connect the dots between cultural upheaval and change, to consumers' emotional priorities, to your category and how those new emotional priorities are sort of manifesting your category, and all the way down to a brand level. How is this ripple effect of change in culture cascading through your consumer, your category, and ultimately affecting the assets and outages of your brand, and how do you respond to that in ways which will drive your relevance going forward? So that's the typical kind of model for using passion points. But in the case of this conversation, we can also do something else with passion points, which is to understand exactly how the emotional wiring of these different polarized groups is different or similar based on things like ethnicity or based on things like income. Again, we just cut the data based on these different groups within these polarized segments, and we can average the differences and see very clearly whether there really is significant polarization, and if so, where that is. So that's the plan for the next 20 minutes or so. I'm going to talk a little bit about who are the most polarized Americans. Again, you probably think, or at least I did, had a pretty good idea about which segments of the population were most polarized. And you know what? I was 100% wrong. You're going to see in a second that who you might have thought to be the most polarized group is maybe not the most polarized group. And then we'll get more deeply into what the emotional forces are that are pulling these segments apart. Where do they differ in terms of their emotional priorities, as well as where there's emotional common ground? And again, I think you'll find both interesting, but if I had to guess, you'll find the 3rd bullet point the most interesting of all. And for each one of these, I'm going to show you some examples of brands or media properties or influence or entertainment platforms that are really nailing it in terms of tapping into inclusive emotional priorities that have let them be incredibly successful in this world of COVID and beyond. So let's think a little bit about this to yourself, as this is going to be kind of a quiz for all of us, but who do you think and what do you think is the biggest driver of polarization in the US? We looked at 6 different polarizing frames. We looked at educational polarization, college educated versus high school educated, racial polarization, political polarization, gender-based polarization, geographic, by that we mean urban versus rural and suburban, and income-based polarization. We can look at any one of these frames across any one of those cohorts, across any one of these countries that we work in. And from that, we can begin to understand exactly where the polarization is the most significantly different. So here's the answer for you. We'll start at the bottom and work our way up. The least significant driver of polarization is ethnicity, whether or not you happen to be white or a person of color. That drives the lowest levels of polarization. Now, again, that's why those can be the highest, because you certainly are hearing a lot. We all are hearing an awful lot about kind of some of the tensions that exist right now as we sort of face these issues of race within our culture. But this is the lowest. And then up from there comes your education levels. The people who have high school versus college education. Again, as you saw a little bit earlier, I'm focusing this on parents. We could have looked at Gen Z, we could have looked at adults, we could have looked at kids, but for the sake of time, we only have 20 minutes. I'm looking just at the world of polarization through a parent lens. So anyway, these are moms and dads that have high school educations versus college educations. After that comes income. These are people that make less than $60,000 a year versus more than $60,000 a year. Leads to the next highest level of polarization. After that comes gender, males versus females, or in this case, moms versus dads. Have a higher level of polarization in their emotional values. After that comes politics. So there we are with Republicans versus Democrats, but not the highest. And again, some of you might have thought from the news, whatever news you watched, that this would have been the highest. No, actually the highest is where you live. The highest level of polarization comes from whether you are an urban dweller, in this case an urban family, or a suburban or a rural family. And look how significant that difference is. You know, it's like we went up 2% or 0.2 percentage points as we went through the scale. And suddenly, when you hit geography, it doubled. So that is where to start. If you're thinking about like, gee, where is the most significant level of polarization that I should be paying attention to? It is not how well educated or how much money these people make, it's where they live. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on as we get into this. So with that, let's look a little more deeply into some of these different spheres of polarization. I can't, again, do all of these, but I'm going to do a few of these. And for each one of these, I'm going to show you what is pulling these different segments, these different populations apart into different worlds, where there is still emotional common ground, which I think you'll find very interesting. And then the third bit is going to be a couple of brands or programs or media platforms that have done a really nice job finding that common ground and finding those emotional ties that do bind for more inclusive experiences. So we'll begin with racial polarization, as I mentioned a bit earlier here. The headline here is that in terms of polarization, in terms of these emotional priorities, parents of color's emotional priorities are very much focused on surviving, and white parents' emotional priorities are focused on thriving. It's a really significant and I think in some ways discouraging portrait of where we still are in America. But these are passion points. Each one of these purple cards is a passion point that we track. And these are the ones that are some of the ones that are significantly higher for parents of color. It's helping my kid get to the point where they can support themselves financially. And concern about my child being a victim of gun violence, almost 10 percentage points higher than white parents. Or ensuring that my child has the technology that they need to succeed. You know, those are the things that really differentiate a parent of color versus a white parent. And on the other side, you're going to see that the white parents have a whole different set of priorities which are pushing them in a different direction. Not so much about surviving, but about a comfortable home. Or giving my kid opportunities to discover their strengths and passions. Or making sure my child feels close and safe. So you can see the parents of color are, it'd be nice if they could worry about these things the white parents are, but they have much more pressing issues, which are much more immediate and sort of focused on survival as opposed to thriving. So there's a lot that's sort of pushing these two segments apart. But there's also a lot that brings them together. And here are the three of the emotional priorities, the passion points, that they absolutely are in lockstep on. And every one of these is about a shared commitment to the sanctity of family and being present with my kids. Doesn't matter what skin color, what ethnic background you have. These are absolutely sacred to both populations. And brands or content that speak to these passion points are going to find very inclusive receptivity in the world around us. Putting my family first, being closer to my child, making these memories together. You know, one of the things that we're hearing a lot about is this idea of being present with my kids and the recognition that there's a real difference between being in the same room with my child versus being actually present with my child. And these passion points really speak to that idea of being present as opposed to just being in the same house together. So when you look at these shared emotional priorities, you know, it comes as no real surprise that some of these companies and some of these experiences are doing as well as they are. You know, because these people really are finding emotional common ground in that idea of being present with my child. You know, Lego, as we all have been reading about, has been experiencing some pretty wonderful growth for them through the last 9 months. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that this is a brand which brings adults and kids together. You have to be present with one another to play Legos. TikTok right now, on last count, had 22 million videos under the hashtag family dance. Now, what better way for a family to sort of be present with one another than by dancing together? And CPG brands like Oreos, in some cases, are making a lot of emotional relevance and a lot of commercial success by just encouraging parents and kids to stay playful together. So these are messages which are going to resonate, or products or media experiences which are going to significantly resonate with both sides of the multicultural coin here, because those they tap into these shared emotional truths. So let's now switch over to gender in the world of parents, moms and dad polarization, or male and female polarization. This one is also going to make your head shake a little bit, because what you can see here is that emotionally, dads are much more focused on self-care, and moms are much more focused on childcare. So when you look at some of these emotional priorities that are much higher, look how much higher these are for dad. We're now up to 20 percentage points versus women or versus moms. Making sure I have time to relax, always being there for my friends and family when they need me, and sort of feeling loved myself. Okay, that's dads. And that's what's pushing them apart from moms in very significant ways. Here's where it is for moms: nurturing the confidence of my kids, protecting my kids from bullying, and encourage a sense of optimism in my kids. You know, I had one client friend say yesterday that they have kind of concluded that COVID has really pushed back women's progress towards full independence and equality quite significantly. And you can see, you know, how this is kind of manifesting emotionally in terms of these shifting emotional priorities that are pushing moms and dads apart as a result of COVID. But all is not lost. There still is quite a good deal that brings moms and dads together. And one of them, which we find particularly interesting, is this continuing trending commitment in child rearing on practical life skills as opposed to curricular learning. Whether you're a mother or a father, you have come to the conclusion that my kid's future success is not going to come from them getting into Harvard and getting cum laude when they're there, but more about inculcating these critical practical life skills, which are going to be so essential to their future growth and success as people. And that's things like grit and determination, and preparing my kids for real life, and being the kid that has the emotional fortitude to stay healthy and withstand the kind of emotional assaults that you're going to encounter in life. You know, you don't learn a lot of this stuff in a school classroom. You learn this in other ways, and this has become a really significant priority. I mean, this will give you an idea of the extent to which life skills over time has become such a much more important emotional priority than curricular learning. And it's just rolling on forward in 2020, even more so. So, you know, this again sort of really helps you inform how to begin to find relevance in this new world if one of the things that you're worried about is gender polarization. And I think this is true nowhere more than in the world of early education media, preschool media. You know, every one of these leaders in the world of early education media is sort of pursuing this world of, hey, we can't be just about 1, 2, 3s and ABCs anymore. A, that's not what kids necessarily need to thrive in life. And B, it's not where parents' heads is anymore in terms of raising their kids. So we see people like Sesame Street with these really interesting new brand purpose, which is not about preschool readiness, but about raising smarter, stronger, and kinder children. Or we see the continued success of Fred Rogers' kind of animated progeny and Daniel Tiger, who really is all about life skills. Or you see the fantastic work that YouTube is doing with their YouTube Kids platform, which is really promoting kids' desire to look inward and find their own strengths and passions, which can carry them forward in life. This is where relevant kid content is going to come from. And it's also where inclusive kid content is going to come from. Find these emotional touch points, these emotional priorities that unify both. The last one we'll talk about is geographic polarization. And again, there's other pieces we can speak about, but just to keep ourselves on time. And as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the most significant drivers, not the one of, this is the most significant driver of polarization. And what you see here is that urban families are focused much more on physical safety, and suburban families are focused much more on financial security, okay? So as we look at some of these things that are higher for the urban families and parents, you know, again, this is about keeping myself safe and avoiding dangerous situations, or keeping my child close and safe, or not giving up in life. And over here for the suburban, it's very, and rural, by the way, it's very much about limiting my debts and sort of paying attention to our financial security and trying to stay positive in a world which has become pretty dark. So those are things that are pushing, you know, urban and rural, suburban apart. Here are a couple of passion points which are bringing them together. And those are very much focused on raising kids who feel loved, who feel heard, who feel understood, and who feel supported. It doesn't matter whether you live in a cornfield or in the Bronx. Making sure my child feels loved, making sure my child feels comfortable expressing their inner feelings and whatever else they want to talk about to me, or just letting my kids be kids in a world where there's so much stress and anxiety. Every parent, within this urban, suburban versus rural construct finds common ground in these passion points. And if you want an example, this is my favorite TV show. I'm sorry, I got to sort of throw a personal thing in here right now, but that's what this show is about. I don't know if you guys have been sort of one of the 4 million people that's watching this regularly now, but it's sort of taken off in a very significant way. This is about a rich Tony family from a big city that got dropped into a very rural environment, and they suddenly discover the joy of getting to know one another. And the parents begin to realize that it's important that I know when my kid's birthday is. And it's important that I respect my kids. And it's important that I let them thrive and be themselves. They do it in a very funny, very lighthearted and elegant fashion. But that's what's going on in this TV show. And it is perfectly in line with that emotional common ground that sort of unifies the most diversive segment of polarization, which is geographic polarization. So I'm going to skip over this one because we don't have enough time. There's a bit here about income polarization, and just go to a couple of key takeaways here, which hopefully you'll find useful as you go back to your day jobs. The first one, again, is that for more inclusive brands and content, the place to begin is geographic polarization, not multicultural, not income, because really when you think about it, underneath the world of urbanicity or a rural lifestyle, a lot of other things live. People in the cities tend to have a bit more money. They tend to have more education. They tend to be more politically inclined towards the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. So this factor really sort of cuts in a very interesting way, whereas rural populations tend to have lower income, tend to be less educated, tend to be more Republican. And Philip, I don't know if you want to jump in with that thought you had or had researched on density.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of sociologists who have now begun to look at density and levels of polarization, and found an interesting correlation that the more dense our environment, that is, the more dense geographic areas have versus the ones that are less dense. That's what suggests the greatest level of polarization. So, when you look at an electoral map, you kind of see that, right? All of the C and D counties tend to vote one way, the A and B counties tend to vote one way. And that's just one level of that polarization manifesting itself.
Right. So again, out of all these different polarization frames, we would urge you, if you can only do one thing, address one piece of this, is based on where people live. The second takeaway is that succeeding with multiple polarized segments does not require multiple products, multiple shows, or multiple programs. One of the things that we also are able to do with this research is look across all the different polarized frames that we spoke about, the 6 different segments, and figure out where there's emotional common ground across all of them. It doesn't matter whether it's Republican, Democrat, rich, poor, whatever else. Here are 5 passion points that everybody has shared that does not polarize anybody. So, showing love for my family through simple acts of everyday care. Our financial security. Teaching my kids to speak up for what they believe in. Living a life of purpose, letting my kids be kids. If you want to speak to any one of those in your purpose, your content, your storyline development, your content strategy, you're on very safe ground in terms of polarization. These unify and bring together everybody across each one of those segments. And then the last takeaway, which may be useful for you, is that for more inclusive brands, content, and campaigns, start with human insights, not category insights. By that, I don't mean to suggest there's anything wrong with category insights. They're really important. You got to pay attention to your category. But every one of the examples that I showed you, every one of them, where people have found success within this world of polarization, has begun with a human truth, as opposed to some factor figure about the world of toys or about the world of social media, the world of breakfast cereal. Every single one of them. We feel things before we do things. Emotions precede behaviors. And there's much more that unifies us emotionally than divides us emotionally. And this is where you will find success in a fractious and polarized world. So I hope you found that useful. We have a few minutes left for questions. We'd love to have you join us. This is a study which is ongoing. It's a quarterly tracker, and it's a great way to sort of keep your finger on the pulse of how changes in the world are changing the emotional wiring of your consumer, and with that, the relevance of your brand. But let me pause there and see if there are any questions that came in.
A couple of questions, George. One on whether you expect the level of polarization to subside once the pandemic is over, or do you think this is something that is here to stay?
You know, it's a great question. Here again, you know, our experience, not our opinion, but our experience has been, having done this work for 15 years, is that emotional shifts in our priorities tend to last a long time. Behavioral changes can be contextual. Like, I don't think that we're going to be buying as many masks and, you know, things of that nature next year when the pandemic is gone. But I do think that the sense of trust that we've lost in the world around us, our leaders and other aspects of daily life, is going to take a long time to rebuild. And because of that, I think this level of polarization is going to be with us for some little while. I wish I could say the opposite. And maybe there'll be something that happens that proves me wrong. I'd be thrilled if there was, but no, I think that we're going to be living with this polarization for some little while.
And then a question about whether or not we see more or less polarization in other countries, and how do you measure polarization in other countries?
We have a lot of different ways of measuring it. I mean, of course, there's very similar kind of factors that work across markets, and we try as hard as we can to have a common framework across markets. But certainly income is one of them. The idea of geography is one of them. Political affiliation. We try very hard to create localized articulations of these same kind of schemes and constructs for polarization, and apply those into local markets. And yeah, the answer to your question is that yes, there is very significant levels of polarization in other parts of the world. Of course, it varies from one part to the other, and not every part of the world has things like racial polarization the way that we do it in the U.S. But we are not alone in the world of polarized consumer universes.
And I think we're also, George, adding a new kind of metric to our polarization to look at people who are disenfranchised versus those who feel more connected to society, to see whether or not that's another framework, a truly global framework, a self-defined sense of disenfranchisement from society, to see whether or not that is another marker of polarization.
That's exactly right. Thanks for bringing that up, Phil.
All right.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We'll be back again in about a month's time with another webinar, which we hope you'll find interesting. We hope you'll join, but feel free to call us with any thoughts, questions, or other reactions you might have. And thanks again so much for joining.